Well, you already saw me in the video before. In fact, I was invited by the Chinese Anti-Jiao Association, which is part of the CCP, together with several other scholars, to discuss the definition of Jiao. And it was very clear that it's almost impossible to come to an agreement about Jiao because for two reasons. Number one, some 30 years ago, scholars in the West stopped using the word cult. The word cult is still used, of course, by the media, journalists, political activists, but we don't use the word cult. The word cult disappeared from academic studies 30 years ago. Why? Because the word cult implies a value judgment on groups, and scholars do not give value judgments. But there is a second reason. We believe it is wrong to translate Jiao as cult. Cult, in the modern sense, is a word originating in the early 19th century in Europe. Jiao originated in the Ming era. So it's anachronistic to translate Jiao as cult, and the definition of Jiao in Chinese law has nothing to do with any definition of cult used in Europe in the past 100 years. You already heard about a definition given by the Chinese Supreme Court and the Chinese Procuratorate. This word doesn't really exist in English, by the way. In early 2017, saying Jiao are groups deifying their leaders or spreading superstitious fallacies. Now, nobody who talked about cults in the West in the last 100 years, and we no longer talk about cults, nobody will recognize this definition, because spreading superstitious fallacies is an accusation which can be used against any religion. Who decides what doctrines are superstitious and what doctrines are really religious? So Jiao has a specific history in China to ban heterodox groups accused of being against governments. And that, as I said, from the Ming era. So I would recommend not to translate Jiao as cults and to leave it in Chinese, Jiao. When I visited China for this very difficult dialogue with Chinese authorities, I understood there are three different definitions of Jiao. If we talk with three self-pastors, and we did, three self-pastors will define Jiao as heretical groups, groups that do not believe in the traditional Christian theology of Trinity, traditional Christian ideas about Jesus Christ. So for them, what is Jiao? It's heretical group. is a group whose theology we do not like. Now, CCP scholars borrow an old definition of cults from the West, and they define cults of groups using something called brainwashing to control their members. This is very fun in a way, because the word brainwashing was coined by the CIA as a tool for the propaganda against Mao Zedong and China. In other words, what was brainwashing? Brainwashing, as defined by Edward Hunter, was CIA agent who wrote the first book about brainwashing in China. Brainwashing was something very bad the evil Chinese communists do. So to see the Chinese communists now using the word brainwashing is, in a way, very interesting. This word did not exist in English language and was invented in the 50s by the CIA for their propaganda against China. The third definition is mostly the definition we from the West proposed. Say, okay, you want to keep the word Jiao because you have been using it for many centuries. But the only way to use Jiao in a non-discriminatory way is to use it for what I call criminal religious movements. Of course, there are religious movements that are criminal, but criminals means they have a criminal behavior. Nobody in a democratic society should be prosecuted for ideas or beliefs, but clearly people, religious, not religious, doesn't matter, can be prosecuted for their criminal behavior. So what is a criminal religious movement? And I insisted with the Chinese authorities, if you want to keep Jiao, please use a definition of Jiao as criminal religious movement. You should avoid ideas like brainwashing, because there is a consensus among scholars in the West that brainwashing does not exist. And you should avoid asking friendly Christian pastors in the three self what church is heretic, what church is Christian and not heretic, because secular state cannot use theological criteria to define criminal movement. Another wrong notion is the one used in Russia. Russia liquidated this year, they used the word liquidating, banning, putting out of the law, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they have a list of another 37 groups they plan to liquidate, and these groups, according to Russian Ministry of Justice, are extremist. What is the main criterion to define these groups as extremist? The Russian Supreme Court says an extremist group is a group saying we preach the true religion and the other religions are false. But this definition applies to many religions, Islam, Catholicism, and many others. So this is, again, a wrong notion of Jiao. We cannot say if a group believes we have the truth, we may like, we may not like, but we cannot say it's criminal. And it happens very frequently in religion. So my definition of Jiao, or criminal religious movement, is a group which, or a religious movement that either or advocates or consistently engages in common crimes, including terrorism, violence, rape, child abuse, and even major economic crimes. Now, I want to quickly examine 5 elements of this definition of Jiao, or criminal religious movement. Number 1, Jiao are religious movements. Sometimes the Chinese use the word pseudo-religion. We do not agree, because to define pseudo-religion, you should believe 2 things, and these 2 things are false. Number 1, you should believe you know the true definition of religion. And if you ask scholars, there are 100 different definitions of religion. Number 2, you should believe that all religions are nice, kind, and bring flowers. This is, again, not true. Many religions commit crimes. So it's perfectly possible that you are a religious movement, but you commit illegal activities. So we call criminal religious movement. Number 2, to be criminal, the religious movement should commit crimes as a group or justify the crimes, saying these crimes are good, people should do them. For example, there are Catholic priests who are pedophiles, but that does not make the Catholic Church a criminal group. Why? Because the Catholic Church does not advocate pedophilia. The Church made many mistakes, but normally when a Catholic priest is identified as pedophile, he is kicked off of the Church. There are Islamic terrorists or terrorists who claim to be Islamic, but that doesn't make Islam a religious, criminal religious group, because most Muslims believe these terrorists do not represent Islam. So there are criminals in religion, but the religion is criminal only when it advocates, justifies, hails the criminal activities. Number 3, crimes should be serious crimes. Homicide, rape, sexual abuse, even enormous financial crimes, huge networks of international money laundering, for example. There are cases. If a religious group is only guilty of some minor administrative or tax violation, it's not a criminal movement. Most religions have some problems with taxes. Number 4, crimes should be common crimes. Crimes which will be crimes even if they were committed by non-religious people. Homicide, always a crime. Crime of being a cult, that's not a crime. Crime of using brainwashing, that's not a crime because scholars do not believe brainwashing exists. So physical abuse, beating people, yes. Psychological abuse, we don't know what it is. So they should be common crimes. Number 5, these crimes should be ascertained by real courts. That's very important for China. It should be a court where the defendants have the guarantees requested by Universal Declaration of Human Rights, due process. You are accused, you should know what you are accused of. You should have a lawyer, independent lawyer, not lawyer appointed by the court and friend of the court. So you should have a regular process and your crimes should be ascertained through a regular process. Now, let's come to the case of the Church of Almighty God. Church of Almighty God, according to Chinese authorities, is Jiao. Now, if we ask the pastors of the Three Self, and even of some house churches, they will say, yes, it's Jiao, because their theology is a theology we do not like. And of course, the theology of the Church of Almighty God is a new theology, is a new version of Christianity. But as we saw, this does not make a movement criminal. We can disagree with the theology of Church of Almighty God, but freedom of religion is freedom of follow any theology. Of course, it's also freedom to criticize your theology, but that's a free debate, what theology is true, and nobody should go to jail for following the wrong theology. Now, the CCP, different from the Three Self churches, says something different. CCP says Church of Almighty God is Jiao because they committed very serious crimes, including homicide. So the question is whether these accusations are true or false, are proved or are not proved. One accusation the CCP raises against Church of Almighty God is you want to overthrow the government. It is certainly true that the Church of Almighty God does not like the Chinese government, to say the least, or does not like the Chinese Communist Party, and compares the CCP to the red dragon of the book of Revelation in the Bible, which is a very bad character in the Bible. However, if you read carefully the literature of the Church of Almighty God, to me, it's very clear that the Church of Almighty God does not advocate a revolution or an armed uprising against the CCP and the government, but it's a theological idea that because of prophecies in the Bible, the CCP regime will fall by itself, meaning Church of Almighty God does not advocate an armed revolution against, which would also be very difficult, of course, against CCP. Another accusation heard very often is that 15 years ago, in 2002, Church of Almighty God kidnapped 34 pastors of another church, the China Gospel Fellowship, in order to convert them to the Church of Almighty God. This is a very obscure episode and even the object of some novels. And scholars should still study it. However, what I can say today is these accusations are not proved. There has been no police investigation whose records are available. There has been no trial. No trial. Nobody has been tried and convicted in China for this crime. So at the very least, we can say it's not proved. As you saw in the video, there is one single incident which is spread by CCP all over the world to justify that Church of Almighty God is really Jiao, criminal religious movement. And that's the Mcdonnells murder in 2014 in Zhaoyuan. If you go to the internet, there are 20,000 websites accusing Church of Almighty God of having perpetrated or organized the Mcdonnells murder. Now, I agree that the Mcdonnells murder is a horrific crime so bad that even alone it will be enough to call Church of Almighty God a Jiao or criminal movement if Church of Almighty God was responsible for it. So the real question is, who did the Mcdonnell murder? No? Crime was on May 28, 2014. 6 missionaries entered a McDonald's in the city of Zhaoyuan and started preaching and asking clients for their cell phone number. A lady called Wu Shuoyan didn't give the phone number and was beaten to death, and there were surveillance cameras, so we can't see the poor lady beaten to death. But the real problem is, who were these people? Happily, I wrote a study about the Mcdonnells murder, and the documents I used, this is very important. All the documents I used were published by CCP. I didn't receive documents from Church of Almighty God. I work on documents supplied by CCP, mostly documents of the trial of the assassins and interviews in jail with the assassin. Now, it's very clear that these people said, we call ourselves Almighty God, but we are a different church from Zhao Weishan, that's the priest of the Church of Almighty God. We use the same name, but we are 2 different churches. Zhang Fan, who was executed for the murder, you see her here, one of the leaders of this group, she said, Zhao Weishan group, that is the Church of Almighty God we all know, is the fake Almighty God. We are the real Almighty God. They are fake, we are real. That means two different groups. Also, the main belief of this small group, they never had more than 30 members, and they were reduced to 6 when they perpetrated the murder. Their main belief was that Zhang Fan and another lady they lived together called Lu Yingchun, they were one soul in two bodies. They were the Almighty God. Now, the Church of Almighty God has another person as the Almighty God, so it cannot be the same church. Again, let me repeat, all these documents come from CCP. They don't come from the Church of Almighty God. Now, in the future, the CCP may fabricate new documents. It's possible. But the documents so far available from the trial, from the interview of the assassins, from CCP's official analysis of the case, clearly show that the assassins were part of a different movement. They were not, emphasis on not, part of the Church of Almighty God. So in the US and Europe, we are becoming very familiar with the idea of fake news. It's an old idea. The Soviets used disinformatia for many decades, but the world is full of fake news. In France, scholars have invented a new word called mediabolisation, or demonizing groups through the media. The CCP has been very successful in using the Mcdonnells murder to demonize the Church of Almighty God. 20,000 websites, including, unfortunately, because I believe they are very serious people, a documentary by BBC completely accepting the version of CCP. So they have been successful, but I hope as more and more scholars study the Church of Almighty God, the truth will come out, and responsible media will understand the truth. Of course, some people may still not like the theology of the Church of Almighty God or its ideas, but as I said, nobody should be persecuted, tortured, or killed for his or her ideas. And as for the crimes, some of these crimes, there are no proofs. Mcdonnells Murder, the main crime attributed to the Church of Almighty God, is a real crime, but done by a different group. I want to conclude with an editorial of the New York Times after the Mcdonnells murder that was written by Chinese novelist. He lives in the United States, Moron Sui-Kung. I don't know if my pronunciation is right. And he was quoting CCP television, who, after the Mcdonnells murder, ran a series on Jiao, saying Jiao are groups characterized by immorality and restriction of freedom. And this writer on New York Times says it's very good because if Chinese wants to look for Xie Jiao, they not need to look very far because the biggest Xie Jiao is the Chinese Communist Party. And so if you want to define Xie Jiao of a group spreading false information and restricting the freedom of the citizens, the real Xie Jiao is the Chinese Communist Party. Thank you.